Good morning, everyone. We're letting everyone get in and then we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tessa Holtz, and I am the CEO of the Long Island Board of Realtors. A couple of quick housekeeping notes for you. Today's session will be recorded, and we will have that posted up at larealtor.com/fair housing a little later on today. We ask that you put your questions in the chat. Bryan is going to try to leave us some time at the end for Q&A, so put your questions over there in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on those. I will tell you today's presenter did give me permission to trim their bio, but I looked at said bio and I couldn't find anything to trim. I think it's all too important to understand what an amazing resource it is that we have at NAR. So today, it is my very deep pleasure to welcome Mr. Bryan Greene. Bryan is the Director of Fair Housing Policy at the National Association of Realtors. He is responsible for representing NAR on all fair housing related federal regulatory and legislative matters to ensure that the interests of the consumers and of the real estate industry are protected. He is also the manager of NAR's new 45-member Fair Housing Policy Committee, which allows NAR to focus more attention on the public policy issues surrounding fair housing and equal opportunity, while better supporting its strategic priority of enhancing housing equality. Before joining NAR, and that's been about a year, right? Is it June is a year?
No, it's been 7 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. Before joining NAR, Bryan served 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, the FHEO, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of the 600-person office enforcing the nation's housing anti-discrimination laws. Under Bryan's leadership as FHEO General Deputy Assistant Secretary, HUD pursued large-scale, high-profile cases that addressed systemic discrimination and provided widespread relief. Bryan also managed HUD's Fair Housing Assistance Program, FHAP, and HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives Program, FHIP, which together provide over $70 million to state and local government agencies and nonprofit organizations fighting discrimination in local communities. Bryan held several senior positions at HUD over the 3 decades at the agency, including a stint as Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Where he was the recipient of the President's Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. Bryan earned his degree in government from Harvard University. And if there was a rock star of fair housing, it would be Bryan Greene. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Tessa, and it's been great. I've worked with you almost from day one of my arrival in November of last year. I really appreciate the leadership you bring to LIBOR, and you're bringing that leadership to my hometown too. My mom's in Queens, and you know, one of the most vivid memories of my childhood is actually there in Long Island, and I spoke to my brother, and this is one of his most vivid memories from about 45 years ago. As children, in my parents' car on Sunrise Highway, we had just seen Jaws. And let me just say, when I do the math, I'm like, okay, we were too young to see Jaws. But, you know, parents in those days, well, you know, things were different. And I'm sure my father was probably smoking in the car. Maybe the windows were down, but we probably weren't wearing seatbelts. things were really different. But we both vividly remember seeing Jaws exactly 45 years ago, if not this month, July. It came out 1975, June. And we saw it at the Green Acres Mall. And I don't know if many of you know this, but the story is actually set in Long Island. The book is set in a place called Amity Island, which is supposed to be somewhere in or off Long Island. In the movie, it's a little less clear. But I titled this talk, "You're Going to Need a Bigger Boat," thinking about this movie. Now, I don't know if you all remember the movie. I was so traumatized by it, I haven't actually seen it again until recently. But the fascinating thing about this film is that you don't see the killer great white shark until about an hour into the film. There are suggestions of its presence. You hear the menacing John Williams score whenever the shark is on the prowl. And then, eventually you start seeing the fin of the shark. And it's really not until about an hour into the film that you get the first glimpse of the shark. And it's on the boat when Chief Brody is throwing chum into the water. And suddenly the great white shark emerges. And it's then that he says his classic line, backing away from the shark, "You're going to need a bigger boat." And that line has really captured the public imagination. It's, you see it in, there have been parodies referencing the line in other movies, TV shows, songs. It's really become part of the cultural lexicon. And you may ask, well, how is a bigger boat relevant to where we are in America today? Well, what the expression really means is the original tools we may have brought to a job are insufficient. And for us, it means that the same old ideas and approaches to confronting problems in our society, like racism and ongoing discrimination, are not enough, that we need a bigger boat to deal with these long-standing problems. And, perhaps it's a moment of shock, like seeing a massive shark, that forces that realization upon us. For those of you in Long Island, Queens, Brooklyn, perhaps that moment of shock was when that Newsday story came out, November of last year. Perhaps some of you, it may have been these past weeks, seeing the protests and in like 400 something cities, as well as the violence in some cities, and just the demand for justice around the country that really has not abated. And perhaps for some of you, it's seeing some of the shocking reactions out there in social media from some quarters. We know we're seeing some of that throughout the country. But whatever that moment is, I think it underscores that we all need a bigger boat, and we certainly need that when it comes to the work that we must do in fair housing. It's no longer enough. Well, it really never was enough, but it should be abundantly clear now. It's not enough for us to check the box, for us to do the minimum to comply with the law and avoid litigation. We've got to do more. If we really want to get it right, we've got to live it, we've got to breathe it. And when I joined NAR last November, that was my goal. And I would have to say that the events on Long Island just made it even more abundantly clear to me how much more we need to do. And you all know that we launched this program in January. We call it a Fair Housing Action Plan. We launched that in January, and it in many ways captured the ideas I had when I arrived at NAR, but in some ways what we saw in Long Island coming out of that Newsday investigation, and really what I've drawn on from 30 years in my work in fair housing, seeing the issues that have arisen all over the country. Long Island's not unique. It's really underscored to me that we needed to sort of triangulate this problem, that we need to capture it from different angles so it doesn't evade us, and that we can actually harpoon it. And that's how this Fair Housing Action Plan, which we call ACT with an exclamation point, came about. We recognized that we had to not only act, but there were certain key elements to a responsible strategy. And it really kind of coalesced. I mean, when I thought about this issue, I said, all right, clearly many have had training. They've had decades of training on fair housing. But the issue that we're dealing with underscores that the training has not been enough, or even if it's been effective, that may not be enough to change hearts and minds or change behavior. And there's something else going on that we need to better understand, better raise up, better address, that will modify what people actually do. So culture change is critical. There's some culture that persists in our industry, in some communities, that despite the training still results in people acting against what the Fair Housing Act has made unlawful for 52 years and what the Code of Ethics has prohibited for many decades. But at the end of the day, there also has to be accountability, that some of these things persist perhaps because nothing happens. So we need to investigate why there isn't accountability and how we as realtors, as associations, can ensure that we hold our industry accountable. And what can we do to make sure that the communities we serve hold us accountable? And believe it or not, this wasn't contrived at all. It just happened to spell out this acronym, ACT. So accountability, culture change, and training, really in that order. That, you know, we, regardless of what we know or don't know, or regardless of what we think, or you know, we have to be held accountable. We must follow the law. The best way to get to that is by believing in it and wanting to do it, embracing it. And training is key so that you don't misstep. But believe it or not, the other ones are actually probably more likely to get us to that outcome. And so that is the bigger boat we set out to create for all of us. And I want to just briefly sort of outline some of the things that we're doing in each of those areas. So accountability, we're talking about making sure that state licensing laws that prohibit discrimination, that require that licensees follow the law, that they're actually effective in that respect. I want to applaud the state of New York, NISAR and LIBOR for supporting the disclosure regulations that become effective on January 20th. Those are really, really important, and I'll talk more about that, but those are the kinds of things that begin to move the needle. What we also need to do is make sure that when persons engage in discrimination, wherever in the country, that there are state laws that actually do something. We need to look at those mechanisms to make sure that those mechanisms work, that, you know, if there are reports that there's some follow-up, effective follow-up, that things don't go to some other body and stay there and never result in any action. We want that for our profession, for this industry. It serves no purpose for us not to hold ourselves accountable. So we're looking at all of the state laws and in the territories to determine what works, what truly works, to make sure that there are consequences when there are violations of the law. So we've got a law firm that's reviewing all of that. We're going to work with our state association executives to make this happen. And then self-testing. One of the reasons why testing results make a dramatic impact is because they actually show you how different people are treated. I've been doing fair housing work, as I said, for over 30 years, and it's the most powerful evidence in court. And I want to point out that you don't need videotaped evidence either. Testing since the 70s has been strong evidence in court, prove violations of discrimination, because you're actually comparing people. And so the typical real estate transaction, most persons don't know how other persons were treated relative to them. But with testing, it creates an objective comparison, especially if you have multiple tests. Our goal is to help companies make the changes themselves so that outside enforcement, whether it's from a private fair housing group or whether it's from HUD or the Department of Justice, it becomes unnecessary, or certainly, companies can demonstrate how they're mitigating these issues. And the only way you can do that is to find out what your companies are actually doing. And so the goal of our self-testing effort is to create a voluntary self-testing effort in different places throughout the country where companies can take advantage of this resource to find out what's happening in their companies and address those issues themselves. So that's the kind of self-corrective work we want to do. Got strong support, many quarters to do this work, and NAR, the leadership team, has devoted significant resources to making this happen. So those are the big issues on accountability. There's certainly more that we can do. In terms of culture change, I want to stress that I think one of the most effective ways to change culture is through leadership. And it's important to stress that in every community, there are realtors doing it right. And we, in the last 6 months have been very focused on, where the problems are, but there are many people in every community who are doing it right, doing it well, and being successful in doing it right. And I believe one of the best ways to change bad behavior is to hold up the people who are doing it right. And I don't mean just like, people who don't have findings against them, but persons who actually embrace and promote, they actually advance fair housing in their businesses and why they advance it, and to speak to peers in terms of why it's effective. And I stress that because, while that might be something you take for granted, I've seen 30 years of housing discrimination, and it's not just, a few bad apples. It's out there and systemic in some places. And so it's important for people to understand culturally we can do better, and to hear from people who are living examples that they're doing well by doing the right thing. So we've got a video we're producing that profiles some real estate agents who are leaders on fair housing. Another area, fair housing in schools. For whatever reason, well, I shouldn't say for whatever reason, we know there's a strong correspondence between these two issues. They seem to go hand in hand, and in a lot of the alleged discrimination cases that I've seen, there's a discussion of schools. And we all know that there's a strong correspondence between where we live, the racial demographics of our communities, and schools. And it's probably not enough for us as an industry to just direct people to third-party information, which often reflects those same biases in terms of, here's school scores. That's not everything there is to know about schools. And so we want to be part of the solution and trying to figure out how we better provide information about schools that doesn't just become a third-party source to reinforce the same segregation. Senator Chris Murphy just 2 days ago posted on Twitter a little discussion, a little conversation he was having with that little video that he, where he was communicating, I guess, to anyone who wanted to watch it, his thoughts on this issue. And he was talking about this in the context of the George Floyd killing and how different segments of our population are still very separate and don't see each other. And he zeroed in on school segregation as one of the key problems. And in having that discussion, he stressed that we have school segregation because we live separately. And this is true irrespective of income. And as someone who grew up in New York City, I know that intimately, that middle-class African Americans and middle-class Hispanics are living separate in large numbers from middle-class whites, same socioeconomic status. And that's reflected in our schools, it's reflected in so many other legacies that come from that. And so that is something where we recognize as a profession, we can do more. We need to look into these issues more and see how we, as the National Association of Realtors, provide leadership in that area. So that's key. Training, the T in ACT, without question, there needs to be better training. And then when we're talking about what we're looking at in state laws, state licensing laws, that's also part of it. Are there effective training requirements to get your license? Are they explicit with respect to fair housing? Are they substantive? Just a review of some state licensing laws show that there may be ethics education, but they may not necessarily go into fair housing, or they may not go deep into fair housing. It may just be one of many ethical issues that are briefly addressed. So we want to create some standards or explore with our state executives some standards that we might hold up. So that's something we're looking at. And then, of course, what are the continuing education requirements for fair housing? All of those things are on the table. But in terms of just our typical training, we need a bigger boat. We need more tools. We need to do more effective training, different kind of training. And one of the trainings we've committed ourselves to is implicit bias training. And many of our members across the country have applauded this. This is the kind of training that many say we need, that rote study of the law is not effective. And so we are providing implicit bias training. You may have seen on our website at nar.realtor/fair-housing that an implicit bias video training is coming. I'm pleased to tell you that this morning I got the final cut. We've gone back and forth editing. We got the final cut this morning, and I'm hopeful that that training will be on the website, nar.realtor/fair-housing this weekend, if not this weekend, Monday. So there will be about 48 minutes. There'll be a training up there, which is really the start of this. It's an overview of implicit bias training, and this group, Perception Institute, who we partnered with on this, they're going to do a 3-hour curriculum for brokers so that brokers can take this training in-house and train their members. And I'm also looking forward to Perception Institute doing training for state and local. So very excited to be working with them on this. They're right out of New York. They're actually in Brooklyn. And let me just tell you, the story of trying to produce this deserves its own, making of film, because these folks were producing this video, in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, out of their apartments, with sirens blaring and everything else that we know has gone on in New York. So they're like trying to find time at 2 a.m. to do this. So incredible product that they put together in this age of coronavirus so that we could bring this to you as soon as possible. So very excited now to have that. And we're working on some other innovative training. We are working with a group to do what's called gamification and experiential learning. Just simply put, it's an online platform where you get to put yourself in a transaction, and you might find yourself as the agent in the transaction, you might find yourself as the consumer in the transaction. And it really tries to give sort of a 360 view of things that are going on and the issues that come up and how you respond to those issues, so that you can actually better see the different perspectives of the work that you're doing. So it's a perfect complement to the implicit bias training. So that we're pushing to get done by our annual conference in November. So we're really excited, significant resources going into that. We're going to talk more about that and just how some of the companies can use this as well. But initially, it's going to be something on the NAR platform. So very excited to be doing this kind of innovative training to provide us all a bigger boat in this respect. So let me just talk briefly about the New York regulations, because I do think this is an important step forward. I think it's important for consumers to have knowledge, right? I mean, I mentioned that many consumers may not appreciate how they may be treated differently than others, but they also may not generally know, what the law is, what they're entitled to. And so making sure from the very beginning of the transaction, they have an understanding of what their rights are and what the agent, the kind of service the agent commits themselves to with respect to fair housing is very important. There are many agents out there actually who are doing this kind of thing on their own. From the moment someone comes into their office, they're giving them brochures specific to fair housing. And I've heard from some of these leaders, and for many people, and it may not be immediately evident to you, it is reassuring if you're a minority person and you're approaching this transaction with some suspicion. Let me tell you, as we're having this national conversation about different places where minorities feel uncomfortable, they feel uncomfortable sometimes in this transaction and wonder, if they're being told or shown everything they should. And so for agents to affirmatively indicate that this is important and this is who they are and that people should expect to be treated fairly is key. And so what the state of New York is doing is doing this by regulation, saying, from the very first contact, we're going to make sure agents provide this information. And so it's doing it in two forms. It's saying, there needs to be this notice. The notice needs to be posted in offices so people, can see it very clearly that this is the law and that this company follows the law. They want to see it on websites, so that that's how we typically, make our first inquiry, so that people see that immediately. And it's got to be posted at open houses, and it's got to be available to anybody who asks for that. And so, it may be effective just to have that information always available, even as a handout during open houses. Great Q&A that LIBOR or NISAR has put out on this. NISAR put out on this. It's really, really very helpful. So that's the notice. But then if you're going to have, when you have a first substantive contact with a consumer, there's also a disclosure form, and that sort of forces attention to this issue. And so for a consumer to receive this and be told what it is and have the ability to review it and then sign that they have reviewed it, is very helpful in forcing attention to this issue and helping consumers understand their rights and where they can report problems if they encounter them. So that really does move the needle. And, you know, in terms of bigger votes, it expands the knowledge of the consumers. So the other side of this, we need the public to know their rights also in order for us to effectively carry through on our obligations. Of course, no community in the world was more affected by the coronavirus epidemic as New York and the island that you all are on. I want to say a little bit about that and what NAR has been doing to help agents navigate this. First of all, let me just say, I just sympathize with all of you and just what you've gone through. Here in Washington, D.C., where I am, we've never reached anything like that peak. It's been kind of constant hum, relatively low in terms of infections and even deaths. But I really have a hard time even imagining what it was like in New York. I mentioned before that my mother, who's 85, living in Queens, is there, and I was just terrified during that whole period. Unfortunately, I have a brother who's there. He's been able to visit with her. We had a cousin who stayed with her for a month to help, but just really terrifying. And I think we all know that coronavirus has exposed many fault lines in our society, on many fronts in terms of how it's affected everyone. It's created it's shown how we're all vulnerable in many ways, how our healthcare system is vulnerable, and it's also underscored, how the perennial fault lines of race and segregation has disproportionately affected some communities more than others. It's also exposed how persons with underlying conditions, which also can often be associated often with where you live and your background, how that's created has compounded problems for many communities, not to mention how you're employed and how that's affected things as well. So, so it's raised for us in this work many novel issues, many novel issues that we have to address on their face in terms of real estate related transactions, but then also underlying issues which are also associated with real estate. In terms of those issues on their face, I mean, right out of the gate, the National Association of Realtors put out guidance with respect to fair housing and coronavirus. And we explicitly said, look, because in the very beginning, we started seeing hate crimes against Asian Americans because the first cases had come out of Wuhan, China. We all saw these things, and we obviously know that's wrong. We emphasize, Fair Housing Act, don't discriminate against persons based on their national origin. So that was a strong statement we said, very early on. But then as time moved on, question came up in many places. I know, Connecticut in particular, but many places, was whether or not coronavirus or COVID-19 constituted a disability under the law. Now, coronavirus, they called it the novel coronavirus because it was brand new. it raised novel fair housing issues for us, issues that the courts had not yet addressed, whether or not coronavirus or the disease that caused COVID-19, whether it's a disability or not. What's certainly true is it's disabling, and people can die. But the question, a real estate agent naturally has is, well, if it's disability, then how am I supposed to navigate this? Because I don't want to violate the fair housing laws, but I don't want, COVID-19, and I don't want to expose anyone else to COVID-19. So we very quickly put out guidance on how to show housing during this age, but also how to specifically avoid any fair housing pitfalls. And so that guidance we published May 5th on our website. It's up there very prominently. We deal with this question of disability discrimination. I mean, bottom line on that question, we said, look, we don't know yet whether it constitutes a disability under the Fair Housing Act because there haven't been any court cases yet. But treat it like it is, because we do know that it can be disabling. It can leave people with long-term disabilities. And I think the other key is, but you don't have to expose yourself to a direct threat from, and if you make inquiries, make them specific to symptoms of coronavirus. Don't ask people, about their overall medical background, or their overall health. Don't ask them about pre-existing conditions or anything like that. But you can ask them, if they have coronavirus, if they had symptoms of coronavirus, and very specific to that. If you're deciding whether or not you want to do an in-person showing or how you want to navigate that transaction. But also know that if someone happens to say that they have coronavirus or they've been exposed to coronavirus, but that they want to engage in that transaction, that you should engage in a conversation about reasonable accommodations you can make, other ways to engage in that transaction that does not expose yourself or others to the virus. And so that could be virtual showings, that could be sight unseen riders, and other creative approaches that many people have adopted. But those are ways to protect yourself and others. But I think we should underscore in all of this, and I feel as that folks there in New York probably know this better than others, you just should take precautions anyhow, regardless of whether someone is aware that they have coronavirus or has been exposed to coronavirus, because we know that many people are asymptomatic. A large percentage of the population who have the virus are asymptomatic. And so you should take precautions as if people have coronavirus. And I think that's critical. And that, I think, also helps ensure that you do not run afoul of the law, that you're adopting a standard that you apply to everyone. Because, of course, you don't want to be in a situation where you're asking the question of certain people and not other people. And there is that fear. There is that fear, especially with disproportionate populations facing coronavirus, that some people may be judged just on their appearance. And we know, just like you can't judge someone's creditworthiness based on, say, their race or national origin, you cannot, with this kind of virus, make an inference as to who's infected based on their background. So it's key that you have a consistent policy, that you have a policy where you're taking precautions for yourself and for others, and that you stand by it. So our guidance helps you navigate that, and I think that's really important. I will say that we've seen some unusual cases. I believe out in Long Island there was a case where a nurse was denied a housing opportunity because of perception that as a frontline worker she might be more susceptible to coronavirus. That's a problem. It may not constitute an explicit prohibited basis under the law, but again, you shouldn't treat groups differently. You just don't know, and so that's a problem. And then we also have seen some sexual harassment. This is an area that the Department of Justice and HUD are really focused on situations where landlords are taking advantage of residents or tenants because they can't pay the rent and are seeking quid pro quo favors. And so that we know is against the law. And with coronavirus, we've seen this issue morph into another area that's problematic. So this is something that appears is going to be with us for a while. I'm hoping that we don't see flare-ups. I know in New York we're moving to phase 2. In terms of reopening, and so the question is, is it safe to go back in the water? But it's going to depend on all of us taking the necessary precautions, and we need to do that. Make sure we're doing that within the industry. And then I just think finally, I just want to talk just briefly just about minority home ownership. This is an area where many people are worried that we're going to see a relapse. Before COVID, we had a gap in minority home ownership where African Americans, Hispanics, and whites were all trailing, African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians were all trailing whites in home ownership rates. And we had a policy forum in DC earlier this year where we talked about this, and I moderated a panel there. And it's interesting just in terms of the evidence as to why those gaps still persist. I was particularly fascinated with the data regarding Asian Americans who still significantly trail whites in terms of home ownership, despite having higher on average credit scores. And so we're digging deeper to understand this issue. We're working with the multiracial affinity groups in real estate, so AREA and NAREB and NAREP, try to address this. And so we were doing all of that right before coronavirus. And the first quarter numbers of 2020 suggested that we were still making progress, that the gaps were still, slowly moving inward. They're really far apart, but slowly moving inward. African American homeownership rate, I think many of you know, had dipped below the 1968 levels last year, but it started to move up again, and first quarter of this year was moving up. I think last night I saw that that started to flag, and that's what we fear because of widespread unemployment, but even greater unemployment among minority populations. And many have been sounding the alarm bell that this is something that we really need to address. And we need to address it as a country. If anything, we're learning, right now how we're all connected. Hispanic home ownership accounts for, over 50% of the home ownership growth this past decade. So home ownership in this country overall is really going to flag if the Hispanic home ownership rate flags. Hispanic millennials make a large segment of the growth that we are going to see in terms of home ownership. And so if that population starts to fare worse in this country, it's going to have resounding economic impacts for all of us. And I think that's something else we need to think about. Someone said this at the forum that I moderated, that the white homeownership rate we hope will continue to go up. More home ownership is great for everybody, but it can only go up so much. We're not going to have everybody in this country homeowners. Not every white American is going to be a homeowner. And that rate may just become saturated at a certain point. And so it's inevitable that the growth we're going to have to see is going to have to come from a lot of these groups that have historically fared worse. So that's another boat that we need to expand. So me just close by just saying these long-standing issues, and we're seeing now these, long-standing injustices in our society are really inescapable for us. We're inevitably going to have to address them. We're going to have to address them just from a sense of moral conscience, but also for the future prosperity of our country. The impact of coronavirus has shown us that. And again, many of these issues, they all go back to the foundation of segregation and how, where we live, we determine so much about, our livelihood, our economic opportunities, but also our lives, just, whether we live. And so we need to address that. And we're going to have to find bigger tools, bigger and better tools to address that. And that's what we're committed to doing. I'm proud that at National Association of Realtors, we were addressing these issues before, and that that we stepped up our game earlier this year to address this. I'm really impressed at what you're doing in New York, both in the state and at LIBOR. It's been wonderful to be a partner with Tessa in addressing these issues. And we have a lot more we need to do. Let me just close by sharing a story. Just this week, NAR had an internal staff meeting where we talked about what's going on right now in the country. And it was, I think, slated to be an hour meeting, and it ended up being 2 hours because many of our colleagues had personal stories they wanted to share, just about what it meant to be Black in this country, to be a minority in this country, to be an LGBTQ person in this country, and just how, while we may just know them as our colleagues, they're living with a lot of pain and a lot of challenges on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to tell you about one of them. So I said I started at NAR in November. Second, I started, and the reason, and I started November 1st in part because they wanted me to get out to the annual conference in San Francisco. So I was in the office for just a couple of days before I was out at the annual conference. At that time, I'm just meeting people, and many of those people I'm just meeting over email. And one fellow I met was a fellow named Troy Greene, who was in the press office. And early on, I was, involved in some press releases and things. I was getting these notes from Troy Greene. Now, my last name is Greene, with an E. Troy Greene didn't have an E at the end, but Troy is my twin brother's name. And it was weird. I was getting these notes from Troy Greene. I was like, why is my brother writing me at my work address? And I realized that this was, some guy in our public affairs shop, in our communications shop. And so, I told him, hey, it cheers me up to see an email from you because that's my twin brother's name. And I hadn't met him. And when I actually finally met him, I met him when we, as NAR, was working with LIBOR to respond to this Newsday investigation. And this guy is amazing. And Tessa may know him. I don't know if others do, but this fellow was one of the people who was just one of the most effective people dealing with these kind of communications and crises that arise in this work. And I was just really, really blown away. He's African American, and he could be my twin brother. My twin brother is taller than me. This fellow is much taller than me. He's maybe 6'4". And during this staff meeting, he shared a story which he told me that he hadn't really shared with anybody. But he told us, you know, as an African-American man, as a tall African-American man, he's encountered a lot of bias. And he told us a story of how he encountered bias during while he was house hunting with his family. He was leaving church, and he was in the car with his wife and his child, his infant child, in the back seat. And they were going to go look at houses in a neighborhood. And they did what you do, what I might do, any of us might do. They started driving through a community looking at houses, and they were really mostly just surveying the houses in the area. And it's something actually that my wife and I have been doing lately too. And when you're looking at houses, you're not driving, you know, fast, you're not zipping through, you know, you're going slowly and you're checking out things, or you might pass like a, you know, for sale sign and you're checking that out. And that's what they were doing. And he did notice that some whites in the community took note of him. And, you know, this is the kind of antenna he has. So he noticed that. He didn't say anything to his wife. His baby in the backseat was an infant. He didn't raise it with anyone, because they were coming back from church. This was a good thing. They're like going to look at, you know, a house they might buy. He didn't really want to, you know, poison that experience by, you know, sharing his paranoia that, you know, people are uncomfortable. And he thought to himself, you know, wouldn't it be something if the police stopped me because people think that I'm casing houses? And you can probably guess what happened. Shortly thereafter, the police stopped him. And the police officer asked, do you know why we stopped you? And he said no, and the police claimed that he rolled through the stop sign. And he didn't protest or get into what he believed was a pretextual explanation. He just said, look, man, we're looking to buy a house. We're just looking at houses. And so I just want to leave you with that, just as a reminder that in this world, in this work, everyone wants the same thing. And just to remember that regardless of what they look like, we don't know anything about people just based on their outer appearances. And so we as a profession, whether it's ourselves or others, we need to make sure that we stamp out the bias that still exists. And we at NAR and LIBOR need to do everything we can to make this a bigger boat for all of us. So thank you very much for your time. I'll take your questions.
Bryan, thank you so much for that outstanding presentation. We appreciate the information and your stories. You're actually a very skilled speaker, as I'm sure you know. And I have to thank you also for being such a great partner at NAR, because again, they did not have a fair housing committee before you got there. They did not have a fair housing staffer specifically for policy before you got there.
You still don't have a staff, it's just me.
Well, so you were able to kind of bring all of that information into one place, so that when I need to reach out, I've got one place to go, and it could not be a more knowledgeable, well-connected source. And so I appreciate that so much. You know, you and I have been talking about the ACT plan since shortly before it rolled out. We are very much looking forward to seeing some of those components and seeing how we can utilize those here at LIBOR. We're very specifically, we're already working with the group you guys had worked with, the implicit bias training. We're looking at some proposals from them. We had an outstanding discussion there. And that's part of, you know, again, as we talk about how do you solve these deep societal issues, I think part of it is facilitating great discussions like this. You know, talking about how, you know, when it comes to housing, you had a great quote, which is more homeownership is great for everybody. And that's true, because what it does is it raises the household wealth of the homeowners. That means more disposable incomes in our communities. That means things like second homes. That means investment homes. That means second generation home buyers, to where homeownership is not a question, it's a matter of when. So we're very much looking forward to that. We're so excited. You're going to be our first presentation that is dual hosted. You know, we've been putting all of our presentations over on our COVID hub, where we've been, you know, trying to give our members great information throughout the stay-at-home orders. But we have also created a fair housing hub where we're highlighting some of the great resources that you and I talk about, like the blogs, the books, the podcast, the things out there that, you know, you can never truly walk a mile in another person's shoes, but you can hear their story in their words and get a greater understanding of what you don't know.
Yes. Well, that's wonderful that you are making those resources available and making them easily available for people. And I do think that the one upside of the fact that we're home is that we have the opportunity to, draw on these resources, maybe in a more leisurely way than we once did. Although I think, like you, I'm finding that this period is as frenetic as it was being in the office.
It has been, but I will tell you, so last Monday, LIBOR launched a new summer reading series. And so we started, it was week 1. So we did books from the NAR eBooks library, which are free to members. You can check those out, either audio or ebooks. So we did work from home for week 1, but we will be highlighting some of the great fair housing selections coming up soon, because NAR really does have an outstanding fair housing and civil rights selection in their library.
Great.
Well, Bryan, I'm not saying any great questions, just everybody really enjoyed having you here. Thank you again for coming. We had you all set for our education conference in June. Obviously that didn't happen due to COVID. So we appreciate you coming and having this great discussion with us today. We will be inviting you back again.
I see that my elementary school classmate, Sherry, said hello. So I'm saying hello back to Sherry. Well, if people don't have questions, that's fine. I'm happy to take questions. If people want to email me, my email is bgreene@nar.realtor. bgreene with an E at the end @nar.realtor. As simple as that. So if there's anything I can help with, feel free to email me.
Thank you so much, Bryan, and we'll be talking soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.